The moment I discovered that NATO military forces had formally advanced into direct battlefield involvement in Ukraine, I understood that the international system had ultimately breached a threshold from which there's no return. The significance lies not merely in the tactical deployment itself, though that carries weight, but rather in its symbolic meaning, the total collapse of the careful balance that has, despite its flaws, prevented a major power confrontation from engulfing Europe for 8 decades. Throughout my 4 decades of examining global politics and how major nations behave, I've witnessed American decision-makers replicate the identical critical mistake repeatedly. They wrongly equate armed strength with smart governance. They confuse being powerful with having sound strategy. And at this point, with NATO military personnel actively operating beside Ukrainian units against Russia's armed forces, we've stepped into truly uncharted waters. This conflict has evolved beyond a proxy engagement. We're now witnessing a face-to-face confrontation between the planet's most powerful military bloc and a nation armed with nuclear capabilities. I need to walk you through precisely how this situation developed, explain why Moscow is now making warnings that ought to alarm every credible expert in Washington, and reveal what the actual conclusion appears like once you remove the spin and the optimistic delusions. Imagine this scenario. It's the closing months of 2024, and for the first occasion since the Soviet era concluded, military personnel bearing NATO identification are actively fighting against Russian troops on Ukrainian battlefields. We're not discussing American mercenary companies. We're not referencing intelligence operatives in protected facilities. This represents the institutional war machine of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, an alliance originally designed to restrain Soviet influence during the Cold War, now directly participating in armed combat against Russia. At the same time, from Russia's capital, we're hearing declarations that are remarkably direct, even measured against Russian norms. Warnings regarding nuclear weapon deployment, statements declaring fundamental opposition between NATO's growth and Russian safety, proclamations that if this intensification persists, the Russian state will view itself in a survival-level confrontation with the Western Bloc. Before you write this off as Moscow's empty posturing, and trust me, I grasp why you'd want to, you must comprehend something essential about how major powers truly signal intentions. When a nuclear-equipped country governed by an individual who's controlled power for more than 20 years and who grasps escalation dangers thoroughly starts delivering what appear to be final warnings, that's not background noise. That represents a clear message. This constitutes a declaration of boundaries that cannot be crossed, and the reality that Western leadership is mostly disregarding these signals or dismissing them as mere propaganda demonstrates a core failure to understand what occurs when great powers arrive at the moment where they perceive their essential interests face direct danger. Let me transport you back to the early 1990s. The Cold War had concluded. The Soviet Empire had disintegrated. Russia under Boris Yeltsin faced economic ruin, military weakness, and possessed no capacity to extend influence past its immediate neighbors. This was the period of peak American strength and minimal Russian power. And how did the United States respond to this historical opportunity? Did it build a safety framework that incorporated Russia as a partner in European peace? Did it acknowledge that a defeated major power stripped of its regional influence would likely eventually attempt to reclaim its standing? Rather, American strategists, especially those within the Clinton government, executed a strategic decision that would reverberate across the following 30 years. They selected growth over partnership. NATO, which was formed for a single objective, abruptly received a different mandate: to push eastward, absorbing the previous Warsaw Pact countries and the former Soviet territories along Russia's frontier. This wasn't triggered by Russian hostility. Russia in the 1990s posed no danger. This was an option taken by America and its European partners to stretch the Western security blanket into territories that had traditionally fallen within Russia's area of control. Now, I must be extremely precise here because this is where the examination becomes difficult for Western listeners. I'm not suggesting that NATO's enlargement was inevitably incorrect. I'm contending that it was a conscious geopolitical decision that produced foreseeable results. And those results were that a resurgent Russia, because Russia did ultimately recover economically and militarily, would inevitably resist what it saw as strategic encirclement. This isn't complicated. This isn't some distinctly Russian anxiety. This represents how major powers have operated throughout recorded time. When you corner a significant nation, when you extend your military partnership toward its frontiers, when you penalize it, when you back leadership changes in its neighboring territories, when you essentially challenge its capacity to preserve control in its customary region, that nation will fight back. The Monroe Doctrine represented America's declaration that the Western Hemisphere belonged to our sphere and that European nations needed to keep their distance. We refuse to accept great powers extending their reach into our regional zone. Why then are we astonished when Russia rejects it within theirs? But that's precisely what transpired. NATO grew. America backed the color revolutions across Georgia and Ukraine. We advocated for regime transformation in Libya, Syria, and Iraq, all of which worried Moscow because they indicated that the post-Cold War framework was essentially unstable, and that America was prepared to deploy military power to remake the globe according to its preferences. When Russia retaliated by invading Georgia in 2008, the West denounced it but took minimal action. When Russia seized Crimea in 2014 following the US-backed overthrow in Kyiv, we applied economic penalties. And when Russia, sensing its strategic standing under survival-level danger from NATO's expansion and the likelihood of Ukraine entering the alliance, invaded in 2022, we flooded weapons into Ukraine. We intensified the confrontation. We openly declared that our objective was to diminish Russia, to damage its military, to shatter its economy through sanctions. And currently, when NATO troops themselves are actively participating in fighting, Russia is signaling that it regards this as an act of warfare, which technically it is. Direct military participation by the world's largest military partnership against a nuclear-equipped great power is, by any truthful assessment, warfare. The reality that we're labeling it something different doesn't alter the fundamental situation. Here's what American strategists refuse to acknowledge. Russia's moves, from a strictly strategic perspective, are logical. They're not the moves of an unreasonable player. They represent the moves of a great power protecting what it views as its critical interests. When you're Russia and you observe NATO advancing nearer to your frontiers, when you witness a neighboring country that shares a 1,000-mile frontier with you, potentially entering an alliance specifically designed to contain you, when you see America positioning itself to control the Eurasian landmass and block any competing power from rising, you react. You do what great powers have consistently done. You struggle to preserve your standing. Vladimir Putin, regardless of your opinion of him, isn't unintelligent. He's examined history. He recognizes that empires crumble when they surrender control of their periphery. He recognizes that Ukraine isn't simply another nation to Russia. It's historically, culturally, and strategically fundamental to Russian identity. He recognizes that a NATO-aligned Ukraine potentially accommodating NATO installations with NATO weaponry placed within range of Moscow constitutes a survival-level danger to Russian safety. So when the chance arose to stop that result, he seized it. And when the West reacted by arming Ukraine and conducting a proxy conflict against Russia, he intensified. This isn't hostility driven by expansion desires. This is a great power responding to what it views as encirclement. Now here's the critical element. Russia has been comparatively restrained. For 3 decades, Russia observed NATO expand. For 3 decades, Russia delivered warnings about this expansion. In 2007, Putin addressed the Munich Security Conference and clearly cautioned the West that NATO's growth was generating instability. He was disregarded. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, partially responding to NATO expansion and partially to restore control in its sphere. Once more, the West mostly ignored it. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea and entered eastern Ukraine, again partially responding to NATO expansion and the Euromaidan Revolution. And only in 2022, after decades of ignored warnings, did Russia initiate a comprehensive invasion. This isn't the conduct of an irrational, hostile actor. This represents the conduct of a great power that has attempted diplomacy, has attempted warnings, has attempted strategic communication, and has ultimately determined that military action is the sole language the West comprehends. And currently, with NATO troops actively participating on the battlefield, Russia has shifted to what could be its ultimate boundary: the warning of nuclear intensification. When a nuclear nation declares, "If this persists, we will deploy nuclear weapons," that's not propaganda. That's a declaration that it has depleted its conventional alternatives and is communicating the moment at which it perceives escalation becomes existential. Let me provide you some historical context. In 1962, America uncovered Soviet missiles being positioned in Cuba, merely 90 miles from American territory. President Kennedy was outraged. He viewed it as an unbearable danger to American safety. The Soviet Union, he thought, had no authority to position weapons that near to American soil. So America imposed a naval blockade, threatened military intervention, and brought the globe to the edge of nuclear conflict. The Soviets, confronting American military advantage and American readiness to risk nuclear war, ultimately retreated. Now here's the inquiry. Why did the Soviets desire those missiles in Cuba initially? Because America had consistently attempted to topple the Cuban leadership. Because America had enforced an embargo. Because America had placed missiles in Turkey directly across from the Soviet Union. The Soviets, sensing threatened, sought to create a balancing threat. And when they did, America declared, absolutely not. That's unbearable. Fast forward to today. America and NATO have extended military facilities throughout Russia's frontier. America has positioned missiles in Poland, in Romania, in the Baltic nations. America has clearly stated that it's prepared to combat Russia to block Russian dominance of Ukraine. And when Russia, feeling surrounded and threatened, acts to create its own sphere and to stop NATO's expansion, the West declares, absolutely not. That's unacceptable. We'll provide weapons indefinitely, we'll combat you through intermediaries, and if needed, we'll combat you face to face. The double standard would be nearly laughable if the consequences weren't so disastrously severe. America wouldn't accept Soviet missiles in the Western Hemisphere. Russia won't accept NATO expansion in Eastern Europe. These aren't opposing moral standards, one legitimate and one illegitimate. These are manifestations of the identical standard. Great powers require spheres of control, and they'll fight to sustain them. The distinction is that America possesses the strength to implement its requirements, while Russia must battle for its requirements. And the West has built a story where American requirements are sensible and justified, while Russian requirements are hostility and expansionism. Let me be detailed about what NATO's direct participation actually signifies militarily. When NATO troops, whether formally identified as such or functioning under Ukrainian authority with NATO guidance and coordination, directly confront Russian troops, they're breaching a barrier that has massive implications. NATO possesses intelligence that Ukrainian troops don't have on their own. NATO has advanced targeting mechanisms. NATO has instant battle coordination networks that are significantly superior to anything Russia controls. NATO has the ability to synchronize complicated multi-domain activities, air, ground, naval, cyber, and space, in methods that no individual country can equal. This signifies that Russian troops are no longer battling against Ukrainian troops supplied with Western equipment. They're battling against the combined military system of the richest and most technologically sophisticated military partnership in humanity's existence. The ramifications of this are substantial. Russian military philosophy has consistently been structured for a particular kind of confrontation, conventional warfare against an equal or near-equal rival. But Russia has never battled NATO face-to-face. And Russia's military, while powerful in specific areas, isn't prepared to conduct a prolonged conventional conflict against the unified forces of 31 NATO countries. This is why Russia, confronted with increasing NATO participation, has started to deliver nuclear warnings. Russia comprehends that it cannot prevail in a conventional conflict against NATO. It understands that NATO's economic output is 10 times bigger than Russia's. It understands that NATO's military budget is 10 times bigger. It understands that NATO possesses technologies that Russia cannot rival. So Russia's only believable deterrent is the warning of nuclear intensification. When Russia states, "If NATO forces directly participate in fighting, we will regard this as an act of warfare," they're declaring, "We will breach the nuclear barrier." And when a great power confronted with conventional loss threatens nuclear intensification, that's not a bargaining approach. That's a declaration that it perceives the confrontation has become existential. What's occurring in Ukraine is the final blow to American unipolarity. For 3 decades, America has functioned under the belief that it was the globe's controlling power, and that no competitor could effectively challenge American goals. The post-Cold War framework was constructed on this belief. NATO expansion was rationalized under this belief. Middle Eastern interventions were rationalized under this belief. Sanction systems were executed under this belief. But what Ukraine has exposed is that this belief is no longer accurate. Russia, despite possessing an economy smaller than Texas, has battled NATO-equipped and NATO-guided Ukrainian troops to a deadlock. China is expanding economically and militarily at a rate that indicates it will be richer and potentially militarily more powerful than America within the coming 15 to 20 years. Iran, despite decades of sanctions and isolation, has built military abilities that discourage American action. The multipolar globe is not approaching. It's already present, and great powers confronted with the reality of American decrease are now behaving appropriately. This is what renders the present period so hazardous. Great powers characteristically participate in their most hostile conduct during transition periods. When the current framework is disintegrating and the emerging framework is not yet established, confrontation tends to strengthen. The Napoleonic Wars happened during the shift from feudal European structure to the nation-state framework. World War I happened during the shift from British control to a multipolar European arrangement. World War II happened during the shift from European control to an American-Soviet bipolar arrangement. And currently, we're in a shift from American unipolarity to a multipolar globe. The inquiry is whether this shift will be handled peacefully or whether it will descend into disastrous confrontation. American strategic short-sightedness on this matter is astounding. For 20 years, Russia has been cautioning about NATO expansion. For 20 years, Russia has been declaring that this would ultimately require a military reaction. And for 20 years, American strategists dismiss these cautions as empty posturing or propaganda. Because American experts have grown so persuaded of American dominance, so assured in American technological and economic superiority, that they've ceased regarding other great powers earnestly. This is a mental phenomenon with historical precedents. Imperial powers at the period before their decrease often grow more hostile and more contemptuous of competitors. The British Empire in the early 20th century dismissed the ascending strength of Germany. The Spanish Empire in the 16th century dismissed the ascending strength of England. The Ottoman Empire dismissed the ascending strength of European nation-states. In every instance, the weakening power confronted with a rising rival selected confrontation instead of compromise. And in every instance, the outcome was disastrous. American strategists have committed the identical error. Instead of accepting the truth of a multipolar globe and attempting to handle the shift peacefully, they've intensified confrontation. They've extended NATO further. They've separated Russia through sanctions. They've financed proxy conflicts in Russia's regional zone. And currently, confronted with the truth that Russia is prepared to battle face-to-face against NATO-equipped forces, they're surprised and bewildered. The ramifications of NATO's direct participation in Ukraine reach far past Europe. If this confrontation intensifies to a face-to-face battle between NATO and Russia, the international economy will crumble. International supply networks will fracture. Financial systems will freeze. The European Union, which is already facing economic difficulties, will confront an existential emergency. The United States, which has depended on dollar supremacy and international commerce to finance its military, will confront economic limitations it hasn't experienced since the Cold War. Furthermore, other great powers are observing. China is noting how America and Europe respond to Russian intensification. If the West retreats in response to Russian nuclear warnings, China will discover that nuclear warnings are a productive instrument of pressure. If the West intensifies, China may determine that a face-to-face battle with America is unavoidable and may choose to act on Taiwan earlier rather than later. Either direction, the Ukraine confrontation is creating precedents for how great power rivalry will be performed in the multipolar globe. History will assess this period severely. We're experiencing the closing days of the post-Cold War framework, and we're handling this shift with remarkable incompetence. Instead of discussing a resolution that recognizes the truth of a multipolar globe and the legitimate safety concerns of Russia, we're intensifying toward direct great power confrontation. Instead of acknowledging that American control has diminished and that fresh arrangements must be established, we're attempting to maintain the previous framework through military strength. And instead of paying attention to the cautions of a great power that has clearly declared its boundaries, we're crossing them. The clock is running. Superpowers seldom crumble from outside assault. They crumble from internally inflicted damage. They crumble when they overreach themselves militarily, when they drain their economic assets, when they lose the capacity to handle the contradictions built into their standing. America is executing all three at this moment, and the tragedy is that this decrease didn't have to unfold this manner. It could have been controlled. It could have been peaceful. But rather, we're moving unconsciously into a confrontation that could terminate civilization as we recognize it. That's the truth we're confronting.